Hello, welcome to the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. I'm David Wheatley, and we're here to talk all things leadership. My guest this week is Dr. Nakia Baylis, who is the Senior Director of Data and Equitable Systems at United Way of Battle Creek and Kalamazoo region. That's quite a lot there. Welcome, Nakia.
Thank you, David. Happy to be here.
Well, I'm pleased to have you with us because it's another interesting topic. And this goes back to the beginning of the year when we were fortunate enough to be able to release our book, What Great Teams Do Great. And we were doing some work with the United Way of Battle Creek and Kalamazoo region. And you were kind enough to give us some feedback that you kind of felt as an organization there might be some pieces missing. And especially around the equity, diversity, and inclusion side of things. So that's why I brought you on today, is to chat a little bit about that and what we learned from it.
Sounds good.
So, and I just want to work through that process because my natural reaction immediately was, no, there isn't. You don't know what you're on about.
Well, that's natural.
Yeah. Well, it's natural, and it gets to the point, because how many times has some ignorant white guy said that to you?
Absolutely. Well, and I think that's why it was so important, right? To call that out and just lift that up, that we have to talk about race when we're talking about leadership.
Yeah, and so you did, and you pushed back, and I wasn't tempted to say, you don't know what you're on about. I listened, I tried to, and said, actually, you sounds like you have a good point there, and let's think about it. And then I sketched some notes, and you were kind enough to critique them and give me some feedback on them, and those have evolved into what we're calling Chapter 9, which will be in any second edition. But right now is downloadable from humanergy.com under our books section as the additional chapter to What Great Teams Do Great. I just want to look at a few things in there that you helped us with, because one of them was the idea of the power dynamic and how that plays in specifically when it comes to race. So what kind of things are you seeing there?
That's such a critical touch point. I think it's important that we recognize that BIPoC leaders are coming into spaces,
and that's just to help us out. That's Black, Indigenous, people of color.
Yes, Black, Indigenous, and all people of color. It's a new term that's being used kind of across the board now, to just try to capture all persons of color. But yes, definitely recognizing that BIPoC leaders are coming to tables in any space, corporate, in any sector, corporate, nonprofit, in city, legislation, political, all of the different systems, with really a heavy lift, a heavier lift than non-BIPoC leaders. They have to come and they have to kind of be able to navigate what the other non-BIPoC leaders at the table, their perspectives. And so, it's almost coming full circle, right? Because, lifting up that, hey, there's this component that's kind of missing, and your response and really openness to try to understand is something that BIPoC leaders have to go to every table with,
right,
every day, multiple times a day, and try to understand the other perspective or other points of view, and then filter through that how they respond.
And that's one of the things that came up in our conversation previous to Chapter 9 was the idea that sometimes it's like operating in a foreign country. And that may be the extreme version, but I'm having to think about the language. I'm having to code switch, is the term that you shared with me, in order to operate in what is classically in North America a white professional environment. I'm having to be different to who I might have grown up as being. And so there's extra effort and energy goes into that for a BIPoC leader.
Absolutely. And then even with that code switching, there's that component of self-preservation as well. Not coming across as aggressive, but still strong. Not being too humble, but yet being open and flexible. So there's kind of all of these nuances that you have to really balance as you navigate through any conversation or moving any body of work.
And and there's a lot of those pieces in the chapter, and at the same time, our focus really has been on how to navigate it as a white or a non-BIPoC leader, because
Mm-hmm.
as a BIPoC leader, you're very, very aware of those things
Always.
because you've been existing in that world. One of the challenges where the pushback was originally was, I get the green path, as we call it in the book, and I get what you're talking about leadership, and there's some nuance that we didn't dig deep enough into that you challenged us to dig into, and I appreciate that. One of them being the idea of amplification, and I talk about the higher up an organization you go, the more your voice is amplified. It's like
Absolutely.
when you get called to the principal's office, you're terrified, even if you know you've done nothing wrong, because
Mhm.
the principal's office is an amplification.
Yes.
If you're a BIPoC follower getting called to the principal's office, the boss's office, that where it's a white voice, that can have a double amplification to it as well. Help us understand that a little bit.
Absolutely. So, like I said, one thing that BIPOC leaders are consistently navigating is that understanding, that understanding the other perspective, and even when, again, if we're being called in to speak with one of a higher, a leader that's higher up in the hierarchy,
Mhm.
there's always that sense of fear initially of what did I do? Did I, so there you go through a process of kind of checking yourself, checking the
And
boxes.
and we all have that, black or white. We have that fear
Uh-huh.
when you get called
Uh-huh.
to the boss's office.
Yes, but with BIPOC leaders, it's heightened. There's almost a physiological response as you're dealing with that situation. And so that too has an impact on how you then respond,
Right.
right? And so it's important. I think it's really important that non-BIPOC leaders understand that BIPOC leaders are really having some different experiences in these spaces and during these occasions,
Hmm.
and understanding that there needs to be some grace given with regard to how they then respond,
Right.
because there is that, I mean, we have an innate kind of response of fight or
Yeah.
flight,
Fight or
right?
flight. Well,
And
it's interesting because the fight, flight, freeze is actually the driver of a lot of red path behavior, the
yes,
negative behavior. And
yes,
and so if the initial reaction is one of defensiveness, and I think we see a lot of this where we see interactions between African Americans and police, for example, that
hmm,
you get stopped, the first thing you are is defensive about the position you're in, and so then that's going to create a cycle somewhat of defensive attacking
hmm,
uh, process. So your call out there to non-BIPoC leaders is just pay attention to that and understand that that reaction may be something that's inbuilt, and give it some space and be patient with it.
absolutely. And then there's the whole element of epigenetics, right? That we have experience that lives within our DNA of those that came before us, of our ancestors, of our history, of our family. And so understanding that that still lives within us. And so even though we may not have directly experienced something,
Right.
that still lives within us, and it can surface in situations where you need to speak with a leader that's higher than you.
Yep.
And so, I think it's just really critical that our white allies are are giving some grace
Right.
for and some space for maybe even a time out before responding, right?
Hmm.
Like just give that time and space for BIPOC leaders to digest the information and be able to respond with what they're really thinking and feeling, because sometimes, because of that flight, freeze, fight, flight,
Yes.
fight, freeze, our nice little tongue twister there, um, that there may not be an authentic response initially, that it may come from more of a superficial space, given that just natural reaction of, ooh, I need to protect myself.
Right. So then, I mean, that leads us nicely to this idea of white professionalism, and we live in a culture that has been built on a model of white professionalism,
Mhm.
and so help us understand, because when I share this with some leaders that I work with, they may say, well, if you want to get ahead, you better learn how to operate in that world.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
what's the challenge for leaders to pay attention to when they're working, in particular with BIPoC folks?
You know what? Really understanding that there is a bit of a language difference. There is a communication difference where something may be um, more affirmed with us with our peers, that it may not come across that way in a professional setting.
Hmm.
And it could seem harmful in a professional setting and come from a place of love. And so, just again, really trying to understand the other perspective, trying to understand BIPOC leaders' perspective, experiences, and really how they're showing up. Because I think that at the end of the day, BIPOC leaders recognize, hey, we definitely code switch. We come into space and we code switch. I don't speak to BIPOC leaders the same way that I show up in a space full of non-BIPOC leaders.
Hmm.
So, just understanding that that's okay. That's okay. It is a mechanism of um, self-preservation. It is a mechanism of connecting and being in relationship with others. And again, I don't think at all that there's anything wrong with having to um, show up in differently, because we all do it at
Right.
some level. We don't speak to our colleagues the same way we speak to our family. We don't speak to our children the same way we speak to our colleagues. We're not going to speak to our pastors the same way we speak to our family. So
Hmm.
there's always this um, dynamic of code switching. It's the power dynamic that has to be minimized.
Right. And so, we look at it, the idea of leadership is the choices we make, and we look at those choices on three dimensions. And one being the idea of, are you seeing the greater good?
Mm-hmm.
And what we're talking about here is the greater good has been proven out to be of more value when we have diverse thinking at the
Yes.
table. And so, if everybody's the same, and I heard something today that if we all think the same, we don't need everybody on the team. We only need the one person. If we think and see things differently, then that's where the value comes in for synergy. But we also need to understand what the greater good, those interdependent connections are.
Mm-hmm.
The other one is the idea of uh, being, what's your commitment level? Are you committed to comfort or to impact? And
Right.
and I think what we're talking about with the white professionalism for white folks is a comfort place.
Mm-hmm.
uh, Being open to difference and understanding and valuing and being patient with difference requires a commitment to impact and for you to get away from your comfort a little bit. Does that fit?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's also important that our white leaders understand that when BIPOC leaders come into the space, that our code switching in the professional setting isn't necessarily as comfortable, right?
Mhm.
And so understanding that dynamic is part of lead, moving green path, right? Like leading to the green path and on a green path. I think that once we start to shut down, once we start to not attempt to understand each other and how each other is showing up, why we're showing up in certain ways or saying certain things or responding different ways, I think it's important to just really, again, for impact, try to understand the other's perspective.
Right.
and be open, like you were, for when others identify our blind spot.
Right. Yeah. So it's the thing of being patient and open and willing to be wrong and see things differently. And
Because at the end of the day, we can't create change. We can't move anything worthwhile and meaningful if we're not including multiple perspectives. Anything worth really driving, if you will, needs to have multiple perspectives. Otherwise, it's only going to work for the one perspective that went into it. And
right.
that's not how society works. That's not how community works. That's not how an organization works. You are dealing with a community of people that are diverse. And so it is important that all perspectives are considered in any sort of work, any sort of conversation, that you anticipate some productivity or some positive action, some impactful opportunities to come from.
Because you're alluding there to our third dimension, which is emotional intelligence, which then says I need to understand both me and the other. And when we get into the idea of understanding the other, it's from a perspective of a white leader. It's understanding when I'm guilty of microaggressions. And those sound kind of odd, but the list we have in chapter 9 are things that I'm pretty sure I've said all of them at some point.
Well,
And
it's the acknowledgement of that, though, that goes that leads to the learning
that's
and the doing different.
Yeah, it's the acknowledgement is the first step, I guess. And
Mm-hmm.
I had a conversation with another EDI consultant leader, Dr. Priscilla Archangel, recently, and one of the things we were talking about there that I've realized that I recognize since George Floyd, a lot of white people have gone from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence. And so that's progress. as silly as it sounds, the next progress is to go to conscious competence,
Yes.
which is this idea of if I recognize that I might at some point have said you don't sound black to somebody, and that's completely I can imagine what that feels like to hear that on the other side of the conversation.
Oh yeah,
Or to
especially when
hear
you're having a very black experience, right? When I've been told multiple times I don't sound like a black woman, and yet if a police officer is behind me, even though I know I break no laws, I'm doing the right thing, I still have a very heightened sense of awareness and a very heightened sense of fear,
right.
and agitation, because now I'm upset that I'm afraid that there's a cop behind me and I haven't done anything. So recognize, there's all of these different things coming into play because you're thinking, I shouldn't even feel this way. I haven't done anything wrong. But the world that we live in has taught me that I need to feel this way, that I need to feel fear, that I need to feel anxious, that I need to be concerned.
Yeah, and all I'm doing is trying to work out how quickly I can get into the conversation that I used to be with Scotland Yard, and because I don't have that same fear, and yet I have a black daughter that's now driving, and I'm worried every time I see anybody pull over now. I think about that same situation because she's unfortunate in some ways, and she grew up in a white family, so she doesn't see that same gap. I don't think all the time, which is even more concerning because she's as likely to want to joke with the cop as anything else.
Which could still go left, right? Like they
Could
could
go
still have
horribly
a
wrong
very bad
very
outcome.
quickly. Yes, yeah. I just want to concentrating on driving at the moment.
Absolutely. And then, I think you bring up a really powerful point too, that leaders of color are not only navigating the professional space, but their personal lives. And as we have seen through, the social injustices that we've watched play out across our country, and be more visible, because that's the thing, is they've been going on for many, many, many years. Now they're just more visible because people have access to provide footage and film and pictures and videos and audio of what they're seeing take place. And so now we're at a place where it's undeniable. The world can't deny it anymore. They can't say it doesn't exist because they're not seeing it. Now you have to acknowledge that this does exist. And so now what do we do to
Right.
change that?
And that's the call again from this, because we use the term of caring, honest, and direct. We say, be like Chad, caring, honest, and direct in order to go on the green path. And I think the example of your willingness to have the conversation back with us and around that was an example of being caring, honest, and direct. You cared enough to be honest and direct about the conversation where we'd missed. And I hope we were on the receiving end in the same way. And that's demonstrated in what we put together in chapter 9. I'm also, something else we call out is the idea of, what can you do? Well, you can set an example by your actions. You can be patient, because as I keep saying to people, complex situations won't be solved with simple answers. And so this will take time, and be courageous. So that willingness for especially white folks to stand up and be counted and say, hey, that's not appropriate. And
Absolutely.
how many times have you sat there listening to a racist joke and let it go rather than being courageous and saying this isn't appropriate?
Yes. Yes, David. See, you got this.
Yes. you're a good teacher. That's all I can say.
Yes, that is exactly it, because people of color are showing up daily in every space with this dynamic of really having to navigate this very carefully, navigate relationships, build relationships, lead in a way that sometimes you don't feel it is safe to be courageous, or you don't feel that it is necessarily safe to be direct. And so how do you continue to lead, and how do you continue to build great teams, right, when there's a safety issue, or there's an issue that is creating a dynamic that keeps you from being direct, from being able to provide that direct feedback that's necessary for growth and learning. So, I think it's a both and, having that grace, right? Allowing that space, being open to acknowledging the things that you didn't recognize before, that weren't in your face before.
Well, Dr. Nakia Baylis, thank you very much for both bringing this to our attention when you did the work with What Great Teams Do Great, and continuing that conversation with me, and being patient with me as I work through my bias and start to learn from it as well.
This is how we grow. I'm happy to help.
Thanks. And the book again is What Great Teams Do Great, available everywhere. That's from Humanergy. And the chapter 9 is available at humanergy.com in our book section as a free download for anybody that wants to read it. But I highly encourage you to read the book first before you read the supplemental chapter. Nakia, thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
You've been listening to the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. I'm David Wheatley. And we're brought to you by the book, What Great Teams Do Great, available now at all good bookstores. Thanks to Brian Spencer and Finkel for the music. Please share any feedback and suggestions. I'm available through humanergy.com. And go to iTunes, like, subscribe, and leave us a review so that other people can find us. In the meantime, till next time we meet, stay healthy.